Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. This is Harika. So in this video, I'm going to talk about how we can create the entities and how we can create entity records in the data service using Studio and by using the data service activities. So if you are familiar with what we have seen in the previous videos, I'm going to use the same example. So here I have the information in the Excel that I've taken. So in the previous video, I have shown you how we can eliminate all the variables or replace all the variables with just a single variable from the data service, right? So I'm going to use the same variables in this workflow. So I just assigned all these things into my variables. So if you're not familiar what are these variables and how we have done that, I would recommend to go and please watch the videos on the data service. So that will give you enough understanding of what we are going to reciprocate in this video. Okay. So we have the data in this Excel sheet. I'm going to use for each row. I have done initialization, which we have seen in the previous video, and I have already assigned the values. So we are familiar that out student info contains all the information of a particular record from my Excel. Right now, the task is to create the records in the entity, right? So for that, I'm going to use an activity from the data service. So to get this activity into your studio, you should have to first install the package data service. Just try to install the package and import into your studio. Once that's done, you can see all the activities of the data service. So these are the different activities as we are going to perform activity on the record. So I'm pulling create entity record activity into my workflow. So this is inside my for each row. Okay. So that means we are going to create a record for each row inside this data table. Very clear, right? So after this, let's explore a bit about what is create entity record and what are the input types, what are the output fields, what is the prerequisites and or the inputs that we have to provide to this activity. Okay. So this is usually used to create a record inside a particular entity. So when I say entity, what entity, under which entity you want to create the record, that is the entity type. So first you can have an option to do the drop down. So to check the drop down, so here I'm going to do the changes or create the records under student info entity. So I'm going to select student info. Clear, right? So next, what are the input records that I have to insert into this particular entity? So what is the input record? Out student info. So I have shown you very clearly in the debug mode in the previous video what this out student info contains, right? So this is of type student info entity. We can check it over here under arguments. It's of type student info. So I'm passing the same input record. So output record is the value that it holds after executing this particular activity. So I want it also to be of the same kind. So that is a of mandatory. It should be of same kind. So after providing this, that's it. This particular activity will help you to create the records inside student info entity. That's it. So let me pull this log message down over after the create entity record, and we can see that execution has been done or not. I'll put a breakpoint here. So we are clear, right? Let me see. So all these 5 records has to be created with all the fields in my data service. So let me close this and I'll show you here my data service. Student info doesn't have any data right now. Let me execute this workflow. So the execution shows that it has started and I can see the robot running. Okay. So by this time 2 records has to be created. Okay. So let's go refresh. See, first two records are created. Continue. Continue. Okay. And it's done. So all 5 records has to be created in my entity. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So now, so let's say if I am working on this particular workflow and I wanted to execute this again, but with new data. So let's say go over here, my student info Excel, and I have made some changes, or someone who is working on backend, provide this information to me, and they have made some changes, and they want me to, update these things. Okay, in the class A 6 pass. Okay, so they just updated this information, and I have to insert just this 7th line, I'm in the 6th row of data into my data service. So now what I have to do, just let me just debug the file without this breakpoint. Okay, so done. Here we can see that this information got entered, but if you see, the other 5 fields got entered one more time, right? So the fields are getting added, no matter what, even if it exists in the data service, right? So I don't want to enter this new field again. So based on a logic that it has to eliminate the already existing fields, but it just have to push in the fields that are newly created in the data sheet. Okay, so how can I do that? Let's look into that logic now. So for that, let's pull one more activity of the data service. So that is query entity records. Okay, let me pull in that here. So what this entity query entity records actually does, let's understand the behavior of this activity. So just like how we have seen create entity record, in the same way, we have to provide in the entity type for this. So I wanted to perform query on the student info. It's very simple. So if you have idea on database, so if you want to write a query, the foremost thing that you look for is from which table you wanted to execute, you wanted to retrieve the data or update the data, right? So this is just like that, from which entity you wanted to perform a query, on which entity. In the same way, you have to provide in that particular entity. So what exactly happens after you create, after you provide in the entity type is, so you can have the facility to write in the query over here. So once after you click on this button, you can see the query builder got opened up, right? So I'll tell you what how actually this entity type plays a role over here. So once after you select it, you will have an option to choose. Okay, so if you select student entity, it will provide you the fields or the options that you can select, okay, from this particular entity, student info. So if you see here, it will show you all the details against here, right? So you can see class, you can see pass or fail, student name, total, and all this information which are relevant to that particular entity, right? So let's say if I am selecting invoices, okay, and go over here, and if you see, you cannot see the student name and all this information, right? You can say company, you can say email, you can see total, you can say invoice number, which are related to that particular entity. So it's just like a you have a data table in the you have a table in the database. So in the same way, if you have a particular entity, you have to first provide the entity name, and after that you can select the fields. So I think this is very much clear. And now I will select the student info. Okay, so what exactly I'm doing here, I have to select a field that is unique. Okay, so how I can select it, I have multiple fields here in my data entity. Okay, so let's come over here, let's come to the fields. So I'm not bothered about the system built-in fields. I will take the fields that I have created. So class, this section, student ID, name, and total. So out of all these things, student ID is something which is unique. Apart from that, name can be generic, like you can have a similar name, you can have a similar section, class, or marks or something like that. But student ID remains unique. So I wanted to take student ID. field, go back to studio. So just take student ID. Okay. If this is equal to, what is the value? Here my out student info dot student ID. Okay. So from where this value is coming? Here. This one, right? This one is the field. So what exactly I'm doing? This entity query entity record will pull the value from the data service. So the student ID is the value from the data service. So if this data service, let me go over here, the data inside the student ID, if this is matching with this one, it will return that particular rows. Okay. So I will give a matching list of student IDs. Okay. Let's see here. What is the variable type? Here, if you see matching list of student ID, it's a list. Okay. It will give the list of IDs that are matching. So now we are clear. It contains a list of IDs that are matching. If it is matching, what I have to do? I have to check the count of it. So I'll create a logic here. If matching list of student IDs, if the count of this, the values inside the list, if the count of it is less than 1, that means if there are no values that are matching, then only I'm going to create a particular record. Otherwise, I don't want to create. So before to that, let me do one thing. Let me execute this workflow once again so that we can let me run the file. Okay. Without applying the duplicate things. Once again, let me go to the data service. Okay, here. So I should get multiple values. Okay, I think it got executed. Let me refresh it and check. Okay, I got multiple values here. I can see. So let's go to the studio now and implement our new logic. Okay, so I'm enabling this query, and if it is less than 1, I'm going to create. Otherwise, I'm not going to create the value. Okay, create the record. So to understand it better, let me put a breakpoint and I will show you the values in the debug mode. Fine. So here it has retrieved, right? So now what I'm going to do here, I'm going to check for, I'll do a step into, and I'm going to check for matching values. Okay. So if you see, these are all the matching values. Okay. So it contains 3 values. So Monica is the row value, right? So it is there in the data service under the records for 3 times. So what I'm going to do, let's hit on step into, it will not execute the create entity record and it will just skip it. Okay. So in the same way for the next. So just execute, none is going inside the create entity. Okay. And if you see, we have 17 total. I'll refresh it. We just have same 17. And now what I'm going to do here is, let's go over and let us delete everything. Now I am going to run this workflow or debug. We'll see the values. Okay. Let me put a breakpoint here as well. Okay. And do a step into. Now we will see it's just 0, correct, which is less than 1. And now we are going to create the entity. Perfect, right? This is as per our logic. So it has to create for all the records, all the 6 records. And now I'm going to show you one more scenario here after this. Perfect. Let's check the output. 6. It got all the 6 values from the table. And now let's go over our project folder, student info. I have opened the student info. One second, let me. Where is my student sheet? Okay, here it is. So now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add one more field, which is Adam, some value, and then 10th A, and then 98, and then pass. Okay, so let's just save this, close it. And now when I execute this particular workflow, let me debug it. It should not go into the create entity record for the first 6 records, but it should go for the last record. Okay, so 3 it's done, 4, 5, 6 times, and now it should go into create entity. Perfect. This is executing as per our requirement because the last record is a newly given record and it is not there in the data service. So it has to go and create in the entity records. So now let's go in our, I think this is finished, right? Let me hit on continue. Yeah, it's done. And now let's go into the data service. Here, if you see, we have 6 records, and then I'm going to refresh. It's going to turn into 7. Perfect. The last field alone, last record alone got added, and all other records or only the singular record insertion is there. We don't have a duplicate, right? This is how we can actually use a query entity record in order to, you know, update as per the requirement. And now in the next video, I'm going to talk about just now if you see what are the fields that we have updated, or mostly the text or the integer. So in the going forward, we will see how we can perform different actions and how we can create the records which are other than the other types of like just like a relationship or choice set, how we can do that, because we have seen only the text and the integer, right? So going forward, I will talk more about them and also other activities of the data service. If you find this video useful, do let me know in the comment section, and don't forget to like the video and also subscribe to my channel, so you will get the notification once after I release the video. Thank you so much for watching and stay tuned to my channel.